Today we are in conversation with the very dynamic and the very inspirational Maheen Rahman, Chief Executive Officer, Alfalah GHP Investment Management Limited. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
How are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
So tell me, in the current economic climate, what are some of the steps or measures that can be taken to improve the current economic crisis?
So I think this economic crisis has been going on almost for two and a half years now, and the initial phase that we saw was where the imbalance began to become quite critical on the external front. So we had the import side, we had the export side, and both were completely mismatched at a certain point in time, and because of that you saw the entire rupee depreciation from 104 to 155 in just 18 months. So I think the first step was to kind of get control of that, because the devaluation was clearly necessary. It had been held, the rupee had been held overvalued for far too long. So once the devaluation was complete, I think that only then can you really begin to see what else do you do there, because your external account, until it is more in balance, it is really difficult to address other things in the economy, because so much is driven from that. So now we are in a situation where we have a weaker rupee, which should hopefully in the long run help boost the export front and control the import front as well. You also have higher inflation obviously coming through because the rupee has gone through such a heavy devaluation, and you have higher interest rates, and due to these three factors you have seen growth suddenly slide downwards. Right. So we are now in a situation where inflation is high, interest rates are high, the rupee is weak, and growth has come down to below 3, I would say below 4%. And in this situation, I think in order to revive growth, you have to make sure that those imbalances which were created before, in terms of the overvaluation of the rupee and too many imports, etc., those don't arise again. Until then, you can't actually push growth forward. So the current move right now is to stabilize. And I think we've hit the stabilization zone. But before we move to growth, we have to make sure that the basics of our economy are actually functioning. So things like tax collection, things like tax filing, things like a declaration of income, things like documenting the undocumented economy. Those are really, your engine drivers of income and growth. And if we can't harness those appropriately, then we will run into the same problem, just a couple of years out. And similarly, on the export front, when we see exports stagnating, as soon as you move into a lower interest rate cycle, immediately your imports will begin to pick up and you'll be back to square one on that problem. Right. So until we really figure out what's going on the export side and make our exporters competitive in international markets, and I think a lot of that really honestly has to come from the exporters themselves, and I think government policy should really move towards helping those exporters who have done well in the last year or so due to the weak currency. Right. Allow them more incentives to grow and expand and invest in their businesses. On the tax side, I think that's where a lot of reform has to take place on the tax code, make it easier to understand, because those things have to run simultaneously. Until you fix that, it doesn't matter whether you bring down interest rates or not. Really, these two engines have to be firing at full throttle. And I think the third thing that is very crucial is that we have to open our markets to foreign investment. And we have to do it in a meaningful way, where regulation is not ad hoc. There has to be a long-term 5-year plan. Okay. There has to be some idea of where all we want to attract investment. Is it in the tourism sector? Is it in the consumption sector? Where can we bring real FDI into the economy? Because everything that we've done so far is just kind of holding us stable, but it's not going to get us to growth. So these three factors, bringing in foreign investment by making government policy friendly and consistent, bringing in the correct kind of tax laws, revamping the tax structures to make them simple so that more people are willing to come into the tax net, and finally on the export front, promote those businesses that have been increasing export. Have a relook at the composition of our export structures. For the last 30 years, it's only been textile companies that have been 60-65% of our exports. But the growth, if you see, in the last year or so has actually come from non-textile. Right. So encourage them. build them. And the last point I will make, which I think is the most critical for Pakistan for the next 20-25 years, is harness the young people that we have in our economy. 60% is below the age of 30. Harness them. We have to figure out a way to provide them employment, to provide them a gainful future here, because otherwise we just lose our best minds to people abroad. So we have to encourage young people to stay here. In order to do that, we have to show them that there is a future here, both in terms of the formal sector, in terms of entrepreneurship, in terms of the digital side of things. So that ecosystem we have to create, the education, the awareness, the social systems, those have to be put in place. So those are kind of the broad policy frameworks that I would like to see, come through from the government.
Do you think the government has identified these gaps?
I think those gaps have always been identified. It's a question of how do you execute on the plans that relate around this. So until you have a plan, you can't execute.
Okay.
Right? I feel this government has the right intention. So there's a lot of these ideas that are being talked about in very positive ways. But there has to be a plan. There has to be at least a 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, 10 year plan. And then you go back and you say, okay, who's going to do which part of that plan? And I think that is one element that's missing at this point in time.
Okay. What are some of the challenges and opportunities within your sector?
So we are in the investment management space, so it's part of the broader financial services sector. So I think investment management is very closely correlated to savings in an economy, because it is really the savings that come into our domain. And here's where things become very interesting, because if we look around the region and we look at India, who we always like to compare ourselves with, India has actually a much higher savings rate than Pakistan and has a more vibrant, I would say, investment sort of climate. So for us, I think the growth potential is quite tremendous. There's only, I think, 300,000 investors in the mutual fund industry. But when we look at bank accounts, there's 50 plus million bank accounts. Right. There are 3 trillion national savings accounts. So clearly investment and savings is happening in other avenues, but perhaps not in this avenue. And I think it's really important for us now to bring that awareness to the wider population and hopefully in some meaningful way grow the savings rate of the country, because I think unless your saving rates move beyond the 12, 13, 14%, it's very hard to pool in resource for the government to do the kind of projects that it needs to do, whether they are infrastructure or energy or education or housing. Until the savings rate is strong and you actually have a pool of money available, how do you find the funding to do that? We are constantly looking to the IMF, we are constantly looking to the World Bank, we are constantly looking for external donors to give us that money. But if we look internally, there is plenty in the economy, I think, that can be tapped. So that's where our sector kind of fits in, and I think it's really important for this sector to grow, so the overall savings rate can grow and the overall investment profile of the country changes.
So basically the challenge and the opportunities are two sides of the same coin.
Yes, yes.
What advice would you give to the younger generation who want to follow your footsteps and enter into the said field?
I think for the younger generation, I think pick a field that you really like. So if you want to come into finance, make sure you enjoy finance. Make sure you enjoy understanding what we do here. And I think the advice I always give to our sort of young entry-level people is that just understand what your job is at this point in time. Really do it really well. Whether it means that you have to make the perfect presentation, or you have to make the perfect financial model, or you have to make the perfect research call, or you have to do the perfect sales pitch. Just make sure whatever you're doing, you get it right at the very basic level, because that is what's going to help you get to the next level and the next level and the next level. And when you are in a position of being a manager in finance, it's very important that you know the technicals, that you know what the basics are about. That's why the grounding that you get at the entry level, pay attention to it. Right. Understand the value of paying attention to detail. Understand the value of what your manager needs from you, because that's what you will require when you go up the ladder. So finance being a technical field, it is quite important that you understand really the basics of what we are doing. And I think all the people that I've seen, kind of come through this segment, they've been technically very sound. So I think one thing is, build that capacity, within yourself. And then once you get more senior, understand what the bigger picture is. What is it that we're really trying to accomplish in an organization, both at your level, at the department level, and at the organization level? And once you figure out how all the bits and pieces, fit together to make one whole, then, your value addition to an organization and your learning and your contribution to the growth suddenly begin to go up exponentially.
Where do you see your organization 5 years down the road in terms of growth, expansion, and impact, overall impact?
Well, inshallah, we'll always try and be the largest. Okay. So that is the hope, and that is our plan, in order to try and get there.
Hopefully, we'll see you there, inshallah.
Inshallah.
In light of your experience, what steps and measures would you recommend to further empower women both in and out of the workplace?
I think for women, Pakistan represents a pretty unique opportunity. I think step one is that women have to want to be empowered, and that they have to want to be in the workforce, and they have to want to be contributors to society in that regard. I think women play a very important role in Pakistan because they're the custodians of the house, they're custodians of the household, they're custodians of our future generations. So when we talk about women empowerment, we have to talk about both sides of the coin. They are women in the workspace, but they are also women at home that do a very important role. I think the role that women do at home needs to be recognized as being fundamental to nation building and to building our next generation. When it comes to women in the workspace, I think we can create friendlier workspaces. We can certainly, I think, educate men on how to deal with women better, and women also on how to deal with men better.
Of course.
I think basic things like time off from work due to maternity, those are not hindrances, in my view, in a woman's career path. A CV gap for me is not a problem, because even if that woman took time out to raise a 2-year-old, that was experience in itself, which for me is probably one of the best HR things to look at. Is raising children teaches you a lot about yourself, and it teaches you a lot about human nature
and a lot of patience,
and a lot of patience. And then when you come back to the workforce, those are really, it's not the technical knowledge, it's the human qualities that you have within yourself that help you achieve the technical aspects, right? So if you've learned how to deal with kids, you've learned patience, you've learned tolerance, and you bring that into the workspace, you kind of need a lot of that when you deal with things here as well. And you also learn as a mother to be very organized.
Of course,
and
time management, all of those
how
things.
To be organized, and that's something that you bring to the workspace. So I don't think CV gaps are a negative. I don't care if someone's had even 10 years of work. If what they've done has been productive of that time, there's something that can be used, in an organization. And, in Pakistan, we don't have the luxury to say no to good HR. We really don't. So I would say to women and men that it's something you guys will have to do. It's something we'll all have to do together. You can't ignore 50% of the workforce and leverage off the remaining 50%. You'll end up with unequal growth, which is where we are today. So both sides have to come together. They have to work together. And there's so many things about how to make workspaces more friendly, daycares, etc. That has been talked about ad nauseum. But the key trick first is getting the women into a space where they want to contribute in the workspace. And if they don't, that's fine. But we should absolutely recognize the contribution that women make at home raising families as well.
How do you deal with stress?
Well, I do a lot of yoga, and that helps. So for me, that's a big de-stressor. I think also spending time with my kids, that's a big de-stressor as well.
What is your idea of happiness?
I think going home at the end of the day and saying hello to your children and your family.
Wow.
I think that's fun. That's my space. Yeah.
And lastly, please share a message or a piece of advice that you would like to give to the younger generation of Pakistan in terms of hope and optimism, and how they can progress in a condition that may not be very friendly at this point in time.
I think we have a beautiful country. I think we have a country with a lot of potential. It can only get better if our youth embrace it, own it, and take it forward.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.